This is you. There's your mom, her mom, and hers. Keep going. Soon you'll fly past powdered wigs, chainmail, mammoths, and eventually stumble upon a woman crouched by a fire, gnawing on stale roots, and trying not to freeze before sunrise. That woman, that's your ancestor. She has no name anyone recorded, no rights, and no idea that you, a distant descendant with internet access and a snack drawer, even exist. But here's the thing. If she or any one of the thousands of women in your bloodline had been born into the wrong village, displeased the wrong man, or been accused of the wrong thing at the wrong time, well, you wouldn't be here. You exist because 1,000 women before you didn't die when the odds said they should have. You're not lucky, you're the improbable product of violence dodged, diseases survived, and rules bent just enough to keep breathing. Now, it wasn't always this bad. In certain rare moments, women carved out space for autonomy, whether debating philosophy in 18th century salons, campaigning for suffrage, or inheriting land in societies that allowed it. For a fleeting few, there were stretches where you could own property, control earnings, or even speak freely without risking the gallows. But those moments were exceptions, not the rule. History's main storyline was brutally consistent. Women's lives were controlled, their freedom traded for survival, their value measured in obedience and endurance. And when power shifted, it was often stripped away without hesitation, leaving survival to hinge on submission, silence, or sheer defiance in the face of systems designed to erase them. So let's take a look at how close women came, over and over again, to never surviving at all. We're going to rank 10 of the most brutal periods in history to be born female. From miserable but survivable to you might as well start digging your own grave at birth. Let's get right into it. Number 10, Victorian Britain. Between 1837 and 1901, Britain wasn't exactly a paradise for women. Industrial cities choked on coal smoke, and behind the brick walls of cramped tenements, life was measured in shifts, sewing needles, and silence. If you were alive back then, your daily routine involved surviving 14-hour workdays, eating bread hard enough to chip a tooth, and obeying laws that treated you as an appendage of your husband. Your house? Probably a single room you shared with family, vermin, and the constant sound of coughing from coal dust and tuberculosis. Your clothing? Layers of heavy skirts and a corset so tight it could deform your ribs, all while you scrubbed floors or bent over factory looms. Want to leave a bad marriage? Too bad. Divorce was expensive, rare, and nearly impossible to obtain without proof of adultery and cruelty, which usually meant airing your abuse to a court that thought you probably deserved it. And if the beatings didn't kill you, childbirth might. Maternal mortality in Victorian Britain claimed thousands each year, often from infections spread by doctors who didn't wash their hands. For the healthy, the picture was gilded but no less suffocating. Daughters were bartered into marriages for property alliances, taught to paint watercolors and play piano, but never to own land they lived on. Even your wages, if you had any, legally belonged to your husband until the Married Women's Property Act of 1870, and that only covered some income. The law recognized you as a person in name, but not in practice, and society made sure you remembered your place. Despite all this, women found ways to push back, campaigning for suffrage, building networks through charities and reform groups, and publishing essays that questioned the very system that caged them. They didn't topple it in Victoria's lifetime, but they cracked the facade enough for the next generation to push further. Number 9, medieval India. Somewhere between the 10th and 15th centuries, being a widow here could mean your life was already over. So, my husband's gone? What now, you might say after your husband dies. To which your in-laws would say, well, you light yourself on fire. To which you might say, I'm sorry, what? Welcome to the era of Sati and Jauhar, two rituals painted as noble devotion but often powered by family pressure, political optics, and, well, fear. Sati meant a widow was burned alive on her husband's funeral pyre, sometimes stepping into the flames on her own, sometimes bound so she couldn't step back. Jauhar meant mass self-immolation by women, queens, servants, even children, when a fortress was doomed to fall to avoid capture and sexual enslavement by an invading army. In the songs, it was all glory and sacrifice. In reality, for real, it was heat, smoke, and screaming. If you were alive back then, your survival as a married woman depended on your husband's lifespan, the mood of your in-laws, and whether your kingdom was about to be overrun. Your home? Maybe a palace, maybe a mud-walled house inside city gates. Neither would save you if the drums of war were close enough to hear. How about your clothing? Silks and gold if wealthy, plain cotton if poor, all flammable in seconds. And if you thought you could refuse, some eyewitnesses, mostly foreign traders and later British colonial officers, recorded widows drugged with opium or physically held down under logs so the fire could consume them. Jauhar was rare but devastating. Chroniclers claim the 1303 siege of Chittor ended with more than 8,000 women dying in a single night, though modern historians debate the number. Even if inflated, it still reflects a grim truth. For many, the only choices were flame, rape, or slavery. And the worst part? Surviving could mark you as dishonorable, ruining your standing for life. Now understand, there were exceptions. A few widows escaped under disguise, fled to distant relatives, or sought sanctuary in temples. They weren't celebrated in epic poems or carved in stone, but they left descendants, proof that refusal was possible, if rare. Number 8. The French Revolution's political terror. If you were alive in 1793 and heard the grind of cartwheels in the street, you had about 3 minutes to wonder if they were coming for you before the knock hit your door. Led by the Committee of Public Safety, a name that aged like spoiled wine, the reign of terror turned Paris into a place where speaking too freely could earn you a one-way trip to the guillotine. Their strategy? Purge enemies fast, punish dissent hard, and leave no voice uncut. Activist salons were raided, women's clubs were outlawed, and leaders like Olympe de Gouges, who dared to publish the Declaration of the Rights of Women, were executed for counter-revolutionary thinking. If you were a politically active woman back then, your survival depended on keeping your opinions quiet or your allies louder than your enemies. Your house? Likely under surveillance from neighbors ready to denounce you for a loaf of bread. Your clothing? Modest enough to avoid looking aristocratic, plain enough to avoid looking radical, and still not enough to save you. And if you thought jail was the worst outcome, well, think again. Prisons were overcrowded, disease-ridden, and often just a waiting room for the blade. Public executions became theater. The Place de la Révolution saw thousands die, their heads held aloft to the cheers or silence of the crowd. Women could be sent to their deaths for passing out pamphlets, criticizing grain shortages, or being linked, even distantly, to Girondin politics. Estimates vary, but historians agree that at least several hundred women were executed during the terror, and many more imprisoned or assaulted. Even those who survived politically didn't always survive socially. The 1793 ban on women's political society stripped away formal organizing spaces, forcing activism underground. Some shifted to aiding prisoners or smuggling messages, others fled Paris entirely. The revolution had promised liberty, equality, fraternity, but for women, 1793 delivered censorship, persecution, and the very real possibility of being paraded through the streets to your own execution. Number 7. Francoist Spain. In 1939, Spain got a new boss, courtesy of Francisco Franco winning the Civil War, and things went downhill fast if you were a woman who didn't fit the regime's idea of good. Franco's government was all about old-school Catholic rules mixed with military control, and women were pushed back to a role that was basically seen, not heard. Once it kicked in, your freedom wasn't just limited, it was on a short leash. You could be fired, banned from traveling alone, or even arrested if you were suspected of being anti-Spain. The laws hit quick. Women couldn't open bank accounts, work most jobs, or even testify in court without a man's permission. Schools for young girls focused on cooking, cleaning, and obeying your husband. Your house? You were expected to stay there unless you had a really good reason to leave. Your outfit? Conservative enough to pass the modesty vibe check, or you risk someone deciding you were immoral. The women's section of the Falange acted like morality police, running inspections and sending rule breakers to reform programs. If you had any connection to the losing Republican side, well, things got darker. There were mass arrests, and in prisons, women were beaten, raped, and sometimes executed. The Women's Protection Board was basically the regime's creepy gatekeeper, locking up girls they called morally fallen, forcing daily virginity checks. Yeah, that was their idea of a vibe check, and drilling them with nationalist propaganda. If you were a Republican mother in prison, you risked having your kids taken away. Historians estimate that 31,000 children were stolen and given to loyal families or church homes. Life outside prison still wasn't free. Everyone was expected to join in public rallies, church events, and loyalty pledges. Skipping them could get you reported by your neighbors. And yes, people would snitch over something that small. Some women fought back in secret, smuggling letters for prisoners, printing underground newspapers, or running illegal schools. It was risky, and a lot of them ended up in prison, exiled, or worse. But they kept going, and their persistence helped lay the groundwork for the freedom Spanish women have today. Number 6. The Salem Witch Trials. In 1692, Salem, Massachusetts became the kind of place where one weird afternoon could get you killed. It started when a few girls claimed to be afflicted by witchcraft, twitching and screaming in ways that freaked everybody out. Instead of calling a doctor, the village called a minister, and suddenly anyone who looked at you wrong could be accused of working for the devil. Once the panic hit, logic packed its bags and left. Accusations spread fast, and they didn't need proof, just spectral evidence, which basically meant, I dreamed you were evil, so you are. If you were a woman who was outspoken, didn't go to church enough, owned land, or just annoyed your neighbors, congratulations, you were now witch material. Your house could be searched for puppets, little dolls, books, or herbs. Your clothes, if you wore something unusual, it might be labeled as witch's garb. The court setup, brutal. Confess and maybe live, deny it, and probably hang. The trials moved fast. Over 200 people were accused, 30 found guilty, and 19 hanged, plus one man, Giles Corey, who was pressed to death with heavy stones for refusing to enter a plea. Even animals weren't safe. At least 2 dogs were executed for witchcraft. The jails were overcrowded, filthy, and freezing, with prisoners sometimes chained to the floor. Some women gave birth in those cells, their newborn starting life already in danger. Why did it happen? Historians have theories. Religious extremism, local politics, property disputes, even ergot poisoning from moldy rye bread that could cause hallucinations. But whatever the cause, the fear was real, and once the first hangings happened, it was game over for reason. The panic burned itself out after less than a year, but by then, lives were destroyed, families were ruined, and the town's reputation permanently scarred. The aftermath? Some of the judges admitted they were wrong, and the colony eventually compensated victims' families. But decades later, for the accused women, the trials were less about justice and more about keeping people, especially women, in their place. In Salem, the safest person was the one no one talked about. Number 5. Early modern witch hunts from 1450 to 1750. If you were a woman in Europe during this period, the wrong look, the wrong herbs, or just being over 40 could earn you a one-way trip to the stake. Midwives, herbal healers, widows, anything living slightly outside the norm were prime targets. Once accused, your odds of clearing your name were about as good as convincing a cat to take a bath. The hysteria ran deep. Whole towns convinced themselves the devil was running a recruitment drive through the local women. You might be hauled into court for muttering after a bad market day, or because your neighbor's cow got sick and they needed someone to blame. The infamous Malleus Maleficarum, basically the 15th century how-to guide for spotting and executing witches, gave judges and priests a step-by-step manual for your downfall. Once accused, the investigation was more like a creative writing project with torture devices. Interrogators favored methods like thumbscrews, sleep deprivation, or the strappado, hoisting you by your arms tied behind your back until your shoulders popped out. Confess, and you might be executed quickly. Refuse, and they just keep going until you lifed out. Some trials reach full-on absurdist theater. In parts of Germany, you could be accused for baking bread during a storm or for having a mole in the wrong place, labeled your devil's mark. And the numbers were staggering. Historians estimate 40,000 to 60,000 executions, with roughly 75 to 85% of victims being women. And the accusations weren't dying down. By the late 17th century, trials were spreading like wildfire to new regions, targeting not just isolated women but entire families at once. Next on the list, even the people who wrote the accusations. In parts of Germany and Sweden, the panic eventually looped back on itself. In Stockholm's 1676 Katarina witch trials, several child accusers were caught lying under oath and were jailed for perjury. In Würzburg and Bamberg decades earlier, local officials who had signed execution orders were later accused themselves. Some were tortured and executed in the same way as the women they condemned. For women of this era, your skill with plants, your birth position, or your widowhood could be a death sentence. Knowledge, especially the kind that kept people alive, was treated as proof you'd made a pact with the devil. Number 4. Anorexia mirabilis and medieval fasting. In medieval Europe, there was a strange way some women tried to get closer to God by starving themselves. It wasn't about beauty, it was about holiness. This was called anorexia mirabilis, or miraculous lack of appetite. Girls, some as young as 12, would refuse food for days, weeks, sometimes years, claiming they could live only on the Eucharist, the communion wafer from church. The church praised some of them as saints, but behind the miracles were bodies wasting away, organ failure, and slow, painful death. Many of these fasting women came from wealthy families, where marriage was expected. Not eating became a way to reject that future, to say, I belong to God, not a husband. Others were pressured into it by confessors or religious orders, told their hunger was a test of faith. There are records of women hiding food to give away to the poor while secretly starving, and others vomiting after eating to keep up the holy image. Some stories were extreme. Catherine of Siena, later made a saint, reportedly lived for years on almost nothing but water and the communion wafer, and she died at 33, weighing what some historians think was under 70 pounds. Angela of Foligno claimed visions from God after long fasts. And there were girls like Martha of Sweden who supposedly refused all food after age 12 until she died. But not all fasting was voluntary. In some convents, new nuns were ordered to follow strict food restrictions, with punishments for breaking them. Starving became part of the competition to be seen as holiest, and refusing food in public became a performance. When these women collapsed, it was sometimes seen as proof of divine favor instead of a medical emergency. Over time, the church tried to control the practice, worried it looked too much like suicide. But the idea that holiness meant suffering didn't go away, it just shifted to new forms. And for the women who lived it, the line between saint and victim was razor thin. Number 3, 19th century female hysteria and psychiatric oppression. In the 1800s, you didn't just have to hear voices or see ghosts to get locked away. Just having an opinion could do it. Female hysteria was the magic diagnosis that could turn being sad, angry, or even a little too happy into a certified medical emergency. Doctors claimed it was caused by a wandering womb, because apparently the reproductive system doubled as a rogue hitchhiker in your body. Once the label stuck, your life stopped being yours. Inside asylums, the treatments could be worse than the so-called illness. You might be strapped into a restraining chair for hours, blasted with ice-cold showers, or force-fed tonics laced with opium. Some cures involve surgical removal of the clitoris, uterus, or ovaries, procedures that often killed the patient or left them in agony for life. And all it took to get there was a husband's signature or a father's say-so. For women with money, the abuse was just more expensive. Private clinics offered rest cures, which meant you were confined to bed for months, forbidden from reading, writing, or even talking too much. Food was over-rich, the lights stayed dim, and boredom was considered therapy. The goal wasn't to heal you, it was to break you down until you stopped resisting the role society had picked for you. And if you thought working-class women were safe, not even close. Factory workers who fainted from heat or exhaustion could be sent for moral treatment in state institutions, where unpaid labor in laundry rooms or sewing shops doubled as both therapy and a way to profit off their confinement. Some stayed locked up for decades over what started as a bad week. By the late 19th century, estimates suggest thousands of women were institutionalized in the U.S. and Europe for hysteria alone, making it one of the most common diagnoses for female patients. Many never made it out, and the worst part, your release didn't depend on whether you got better, it depended on whether the same people who put you there decided they were done with you. Jewish women in the Holocaust. Between 1941 and 1945, being a Jewish woman in Nazi-occupied Europe meant your gender and religion put you on a one-way ticket to hell. Roundups happened without warning. Soldiers kicked in doors, dragged families in the street, and shoved them into cattle cars so cramped you couldn't even sit down. People had no idea where they were going, just that it wasn't good. When the train doors opened, you were herded off into lines, shouted at in a language you might not understand, and sorted in seconds. The young and healthy were sent to hard labor. The elderly, sick, or pregnant, straight to their deaths. Camps like Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, and Bergen-Belsen packed thousands into filthy wooden barracks with almost no food. Lice, typhus, and dysentery spread fast, and one bad cough could take out half a room. Some women were picked out for experiments. At Ravensbrück, they were literally infecting people on purpose to test antibiotics. And no, this was not some primitive shot. This was open wounds stuffed with dirt and glass. At Auschwitz, Joseph Mengele ran medical research that included sterilization trials and chemical injections that wrecked women's bodies for life. Sexual abuse was everywhere. SS guards and prisoner overseers targeted women constantly, and some camps had forced brothels where women were made to serve as both guards and selected prisoners. Saying no wasn't really an option unless you also wanted a bullet. Even in all this, women fought back. They smuggled scraps of food, passed secret notes, and hid sick prisoners from roll calls. In 1944, a group of women at Auschwitz smuggled gunpowder from a munitions factory, blowing up part of Crematorium 4, basically the deadliest "don't mess with us" in history. By liberation, survivors had lost families, homes, and everything they owned. They walked out of the camps alive, but starting over meant doing it with nothing. No money, no community, just the will to keep going after the worst years anyone could imagine. Number 1. Japanese women in Manchuria, 1945. When World War II ended, Japan surrendered and the Soviet army rolled into Manchuria like it was an all-you-can-take buffet. For Japanese civilians stuck there, liberation didn't mean parades and flowers. It meant looting, violence, and assaults on a scale that could empty entire villages overnight. Some families, desperate to keep most of the household alive, made a deal so grim it sounds made up. They handed over their own daughters to the soldiers. These girls were sent to garrisons, depots, or just abandoned buildings where Soviet troops were camped. Ages ranged from barely teenagers to women in their 20s. They were expected to serve dozens of men a day, fed scraps if anything, and left without medical care. Injuries, infections, and STDs spread so fast that some didn't survive more than a few weeks. Survivors didn't exactly get a hero's welcome back home. Post-war Japan mostly acted like they didn't exist, and if your community found out, you could kiss marriage, jobs, and social acceptance goodbye. A lot of women kept quiet for decades, some never even telling their own families. Others never made it back to Japan at all, ending up stuck in China or the Soviet Union for the rest of their lives. Some weren't even told what was happening until it was too late. They were told they'd be doing war work or helping the family, only to be dumped at a Soviet base with no way to leave. Once you were there was no escape, and trying could get you shot. It took until the late 20th century for survivors to start speaking publicly. Even then, it was a fight to get their stories heard. There are a few statues and memorials now, and historians are piecing together records, but most names have been lost. We know the scale. Some historians estimate up to 10,000 Japanese women were left in Manchuria when the Soviets arrived. But the individual stories, those are disappearing fast. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell to stay up to date on all the nutty stories from humanity's past.